Very nice of all you to spend a Friday evening with me. It's a nice evening out, so of course, kick your feet up, relax. It's been a long week of work, but you got me tonight, Mike the New Haven, and a great guest who I'll introduce momentarily. Welcome back to episode. Well, this is really 310, as I labeled it mistakenly as 311, but it's really 310, so we'll change that later because last episode was supposed to be 310, but unfortunately, our guest had some complications, so we had to push that one back. So it just turned into I guess, a power hour, if you will, a bonus segment, in which I was able to just kind of catch up on the happenings of recent events in New York City and really just anything going on in society these days. And you were nice enough to spend that hour with me. But tonight's 310, of course. And I think before that, our previous guest was Carrie Barrett, former NBC News anchor for Channel 4 in New York City. And she was a lot of fun to talk to. She had a 19-year run in journalism, of course, across multiple different stations. She's now doing very well as a consultant. So it was good to catch up with her because watching her on Channel 4 over the years and being connected with her on LinkedIn, I'm like, I really should reach out to her. And I'm glad I did because she was awesome. That was a great show. So go check that one out if you haven't already. Hello to Joe Maliga, Don Gonzalez, John Costello, Patrick Hetzel, and Darren Phillips tuning in tonight. Anybody else that's watching via LinkedIn, of course, Twitter/X. Appreciate all you being here. We're going to go through a couple sponsors as we always do before the guest. And the first one is the newly minted MC Media Editing Services, LLC. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. Want to make some headway with that, so of course there is my website too, www.mcmediaeditingservicesllc.com, which you can find. The link to it is in the description of this episode. Now, if you need a PI, for whatever the reasons may be, look no further than the one and only Bill Ryan. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson and Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Proud supporter and ever the good collaborator with me on numerous projects over the years. He is indeed. All right. My next guest, from the Bronx to scuba to gun suppression to gangs, his 20 years in the New York City Police Department were certainly not boring. They were quite frankly full of adventure. Came onto the job in 1998 and he stayed through 2018 and even 20 years on the job, but he packed a lot into those 20 years. And that tonight here on the Mike the New Haven podcast is retired NYPD detective George Sichler. George, welcome. How are you?
Hi, Mike. How are you?
Hang on a second. There he is. There you are. Welcome. How are you?
I'm great. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good. Had a little bit of a delay there on our end, but that's okay. We made up for it. So here you are. Good to have you. It's been a long time coming. A friend of ours, a mutual friend of ours, put us in touch. So thank you to that friend who I'm sure is tuning in tonight. So as far as the early years, before I get into your career and joining the PD in the late 90s, tell me about where you grew up. And did you always know or have an inclination early on you wanted to go into, if not law enforcement, at least some type of civil service?
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in the Bronx, in Throgs Neck specifically. My father was retired NYPD. I grew up in the street, in the Throgs Neck, playing cops and robbers every day or playing Army every day. And then just couldn't get it out of my system, right? Took a test, back in the mid-90s, I guess, and turned the job down a couple times. I thought I was going to be a doctor. And then, I ended up coming on board in 1998.
Everything happens for a reason, and certainly better late than never. So This is interesting because usually guys are coming on the job, or most of the guys I've spoken to are coming onto the job during the 70s, 80s, or early 90s when the city was a war zone. A lot of crime going on, and it was a really, really borderline Herculean effort to clean the streets up. That's not to say there's still not work to do by 1998, but 1998, the city's in much better shape. It's kind of that in the middle, it's smack dab in the middle of that glory period. Crime's going down. It started with Bratton. Safer's the commissioner at the time. He's continuing the crime decline. It's a good time to be a police officer in New York City, but there's still work to be done. And starting out in the 4-6, you were certainly working, but coming on in an era in which, crime's in decline, morale is up. What was that like for you that first year, 98?
You go to the police academy, you get out. I grew up in the Bronx. I had been to Yankee Stadium, but I guess my first, couple of nights in, the 4-6 was certainly culture shock. And then, it was a great place to play cops and robbers. We were very busy every night. It was a phenomenal group of people, on patrol in the specialized units and the detective squad. I mean, those guys that were there in the 80s into the early 90s, I mean, frankly, they were real superheroes.
Oh, of course, of course. And they're great guys to learn from because, as I've said before, rather if you're a rookie firefighter or a rookie police officer anywhere, but especially in New York City, those senior guys and gals, even indirectly, they're teaching you stuff because you observe them around the precinct, the firehouse doing something. I guess I could try that. I might want to inculcate that. And maybe you never ask them about it, but quietly you copy the method. So that first year, again, heck of a time to be in the Bronx. The Yankees are smack dab in the middle of their dynasty, and that was their peak year. They won 114 games that year during the regular season. So being there during that time and observing some of the more senior guys, but also working the street, no more NSUs by this point. They had long since gone away. Tell me about who most taught you during that time period, 98, 99. Do you recall your first arrest?
Not in the 4-6. I mean, we were in field training. I remember my first arrest because it was a mess. Right, it was a McGilla way back then. But we were sent out to foot patrol. Right, we went out to 183rd Street and Grand Concourse, up and down, and there was 8 or 10 of us on every street corner. Up and down the Grand Concourse, and we stood out there for weeks and weeks and weeks and months on end, and then little by little we got filtered into sector cars, and and eventually you got to ride around in a sector. But we walked on foot, for quite a bit. You got stuck doing prisoner transports in the beginning. I think way back then the 4-6 was one or two of commands that actually had what they called a paddy wagon back then. We would transport 15, 18 prisoners down to central booking, as rookies, and not even knowing what we were doing. It was a very steep learning curve. I don't think I would trade it for the world because it was just a great group of people to learn from for sure.
Oh, I can imagine. I can imagine. During that time period, like I said, there's a lot of guys that are still on the job from those warriors, as you pointed out earlier. You did mention culture shock earlier, and I think that's interesting. So I wanted to kind of expand on that here. Even though it was daunting at first, naturally, if you're a rookie at anything, it's daunting. It's a transition to a new chapter in your life, and you want to make sure that you do a good job. Do you feel that the pressure was lesser compared to somebody coming in maybe from a different borough that grew up in an entirely different setting, or Long Island, as we see with a lot of cops, given the fact that you grew up in the Bronx, you understood the borough better than most?
I mean, Throgs Neck certainly wasn't rough and tumble. You had to have your head on your shoulders, for sure. And you grew up, with, I guess, what we call street smarts. But when you get into some of those, tougher neighborhoods, it's a very different, I mean, you walked around, you always had to be looking up, you had to stand underneath fire escapes. You had to be very cognizant of where you were standing, where you were walking at all times, right? It was a little bit different.
Transitioning from foot patrol into a sector car, those old old school Chevy Caprices, with the NYC police written on the side. My favorite version of the NYPD's fleet, by the way, unbeaten, their 90s fleet of all the fleets they've had, to me is the best. It's quite the transition because I feel like, and it's not to say you lose something when you go into a sector car. An attentive cop is an attentive cop 10 times over. It doesn't matter where they're working. But there's different facets to how you work foot patrol versus a sector car. And you're listening to the radio. Sometimes you're just observing things by looking out the window. Remember the old timers saying that during the winter, they'd have the heat on and the window down to hear what's going on the street. So for you, tell me about working that sector car, being observant, and some of the more interesting calls early on that came over the radio that because you were observant, you were able to get a good jump on.
I guess it was, you make a funny thing about the bubble cars back then. And you had to have a milk crate in the back so they wouldn't always fall down and stuff. Those were great. But I mean, we ran around, doing 25, 30 radio runs a night from one 85 to another and one shots fired to another domestic dispute. Some of the ones I can remember, some of the heavy ones back then were, you couldn't get into a building. Somebody was calling for an 85 and, you try to figure out how to scale a fire escape to get up to them and stuff. And, some of those things got to be pretty hairy for sure. Big melees, on 183rd Street, Jerome Avenue. And, you didn't hear, no further, it was keep them coming central, right? There was certainly our fair share of those.
I can imagine. You mentioned, of course, working in the 4-6, you're right near Yankee Stadium. You're basically in the background of Yankee Stadium there. And as I talked about earlier, it's a great place to work, especially if you're a Yankee fan. And even if you're not, you get to be detailed there. And this is a heck of a time to be detailed there. They win 4 championships in 5 years. Was there ever a point, or rather, what was the first time you can recall being detailed to Yankee Stadium during your time in the 4-6?
I don't remember the very first time, but the significant time, one of my favorite stories was it was probably 99 or 2000 when they won the World Series at home. And we're getting ready to line up the field. And the old timers telling you, you got to put your helmets on. We're like, well, we're going to win. What do we have to put a helmet on? They throw batteries anyway. So we end up lining the field. They win the World Series and we're out there. And it was, maybe had a year on the job and you're terrified that you're going to do something wrong. And I remember growing up, my father taking me to Yankee games. I'm standing on the field. I was probably in like the left field line, and I bend down. I pick up a piece of grass, and I said I had World Series grass, and I was going to plant it at my house at home when I got home. And we get home 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I left the grass on on my kitchen table. I wake up the next morning to tell my wife, and I was like, "You'll never guess what I have. I got World Series grass on the table." And she goes out looking for it. She goes, "There's nothing there. There's just dirt there." The dog ate it. The dog had jumped up on the table and ate my 2000 World Series, Yankee Stadium World Series grass.
Yeah. That was when they won it at home, although 2000, they technically won it at home too because they won it at Shea. 99 is when they won it at Yankee Stadium. They swept the Braves that year. Yep, they swept the Braves that year, and it was a Keith Lockhart fly out to Chad Curtis to end it. And it's funny because if you look at that celebration when they beat the Braves versus 22 years prior, 1977 when they beat the Dodgers, night and day, because that celebration, the Yankees didn't even have time to celebrate after that final out. And if you look, Reggie Jackson's boiling, he's just running over people left and right like a linebacker to get to the locker room. So the NYPD definitely had a good sense of crowd control in the late 90s that they didn't quite have in the late 70s. So I asked this because, of course, you were on the job during that time. 2001 comes around, and of course, there's September 11th. Now, you weren't new by that time, I should say. You had 3 years on the job, but nevertheless, you're newer. And this is I'm sure in your 20-year career, the biggest obstacle you'd ever faced. So just being down there at Ground Zero, if you were at all. 2 questions here. One, what do you recall from that period in late 01, early 02? And of those 23 officers that died that day, did you know any of them personally?
I knew of a couple of them. I know Stephen Driscoll, actually, when I was looking to get out of the 4-6, I was looking to go into SOD. He actually lived right down the street here. We kind of met each other through a couple of mutual people. But I didn't really know anybody very personally at that point, just, from kind of around the Bronx. The biggest thing to me are the smells, right? I mean, you just never get those smells out of you. I remember probably it was the makeshift morgue, which was, I think is now the Amex building right down there by the where the atrium is. We had to go in there to get equipment or something like that. It was the makeshift morgue, and it smelled like formaldehyde, from way back then. And fast forward a year or two after that, and I get into scuba, and President Bush was coming to town. We had to do some diving underneath. I won't get into the specifics of it, but we had to go underneath the atrium via the Hudson River. And we came up. The dive was completed. We ended up going in. The atrium was open at that point because it was a year later. Maybe it was like almost a 1-year anniversary, maybe, or the 2-year anniversary, whatever it was. And we walk in there, and it wasn't. And there was no smell anymore because there was like the restaurants were starting to pop open again and stuff like that. But that was a very surreal experience. A year before, it was a morgue, and it smelled like formaldehyde. And a year later, the president's coming in there, because and the glass was all rebuilt then. And 2001, all that glass was just all over the place at that point. But that was there, and I just remember the dust. The dust was very, very significant, and being on the bucket brigade. And, I remember a couple of, you know, um, fire gear or police gear that would come across you in the bucket that was, you knew was somebody's. They were, those are pretty tough ones for sure.
No, I can imagine. Thank you for sharing that. And Steve Driscoll, for my ESU miniseries, I've spoken to a lot of guys over the years that work with Steve in Ford Truck or just work with him, period, in emergency service. And they all described him as a really great guy and a really great cop. He was excellent at what he did in ESU. He was really, for the majority of his career, SOD because he was street crime before he went into emergency. I think he got to emergency 96 or so. And the entire time he was there, just really dynamite E-man who's definitely loved and missed. So thank you for mentioning him as well. So going into SOD, there's so many different possibilities in SOD. I mentioned emergency. Street crime was at the end of its life here in the NYPD. It went away in 2002, but you had that, and other components, of course, harbor you could go into. So what was it that attracted you to scuba? What was your background that made you say, you know what, I want to go for this?
So growing up in Throgs Neck, there was a dive shop on City Island, and he was an old scuba guy. I was already certified, just a recreational diver. Grew up in, diving for lobsters in Eastchester Bay, and was Blackwater dive and stuff like that. And then, the 4.6 was great, but it definitely wears you down for sure. And then it was like, where do we go from here? So scuba was what really, and still is at the time, and back then at the time was really the only thing that you could kind of get into based on your own merits, based on the physical standards, that we had and the water tests you had to go through. And that attracted me right to it for sure. Cause I only had a couple of years on the job, so it wasn't like I had anybody, that was looking out for me at any point. So, knowing that he had a great career, kind of seeing all the news articles that he had, accomplished in his career. I'll give him a shout out, Mike Carew for sure. Captain Mike's diving up in City Island. But talking to him, going in the dive shop and kind of learning that, you're in helicopters, you're in boats, you're in trucks going to Central Park, and just that whole freedom and being in maritime and being in aviation. And, that was kind of it. And said, I can get there by doing push-ups and pull-ups, sign me up.
There you go. And it's such a demanding, any job in SOD period, whether you're doing emergency service work or harbor or anything else, it's very physically demanding. And here you're underwater, and there's so many different scenarios you can be thrown into, especially being part of air sea rescue. So tell me, I know about the ESU process from interviewing as many guys as I have there in terms of how long it takes to get into emergency and the physical requirements. But for those not familiar with what it takes for scuba, besides being adept in the water and knowing how to swim, basic stuff like that, how long is the training and what are some of the physical components that they put you through?
So first and foremost, right? So when I got in 2002, a lot of guys were retiring, right? So there was a lot of openings there. And we probably took the test with maybe 60 or 70 people, like the physical test. And there's a written test, there's a physical test. And I think out of 70 of us, I think there was probably only 8 or 10 of us that passed it. So it's getting in, it's a physical standard. Push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, water competency. If you make it through all that stuff at the very end, I guess to be politically correct, we'll call it water confidence, right? At the end where, you just have to, if you ever seen like Navy dive school, we're not that intense. So I won't compare us to, to those guys. But there's a harassment exercise on the water, to make sure that you're not going to freak out if things go bad on the water. And you go on from there. So if you make it through all that stuff and they pick you up for the team, usually anywhere from 6 to 12 months of training, right? So you'll come in as just like a regular open water diver. Some guys, there was Navy divers, there was rescue swimmers, they were really an elite bunch of different types of athletes in that unit. They came from all sorts of military special operations backgrounds, some of the guys, and just some of them were just all around collegiate jocks. 6 to 12 months of training, and then they turn you into, a police frogman at that point.
I like how you put that police frogman. We're talking with George Sichler, former NYPD diver and also detective in Bronx gangs and Bronx gun suppression. If you have a question for him, I should say, please feel free to throw it in the super chat and I'll highlight it at the appropriate time. I should shout out Paul Meyenberg. I forgot to shout him out earlier. John Latanzio, another former E-man. He worked in Truck 5 and Truck 3, and he's always here. Good to see you both on this Friday evening. So I mentioned the difference in callouts. Naturally, when you think of air sea rescue, you're thinking, okay, well, you're diving into the water, capsized boats, vessels in distress, swimmers in distress, and that's part of it. But also, I mean, as I've seen over the years, it's evidence collection too. Somebody's running, a couple of patrol cops hop out a sector car on a foot chase. Guy throws a gun into the water, so there's plenty of that. Tell me about, of course, the call outs for things like that and some of the more interesting ones you've had early on, besides the security details, like you mentioned earlier, with President Bush.
So I remember one specifically. We called they were called tadpoles when you were a young guy, right? So we used to young tadpole there. Then we were out in Howard Beach, and I guess a couple of kids had broken into an old World War II veteran's house. He had passed away. I guess the house was in probate, and I guess they caught a couple of kids, and they had some explosive devices on them, and they had kind of thrown it, into the water. They got rid of it. So when we deal with explosives and stuff, we usually deal with Navy EOD, and then later time, the bomb squad as well. But Navy EOD would come up, and we were looking for, I think they were mortar rounds or 40 mic grenades, that were thrown into the Jamaica Bay. I think it was in Jamaica Bay. So that was a pretty significant thing, because at the time we didn't know if they were inert or if we didn't know if they were live devices. And then the Navy EOD guys from Detachment Earl, which is down in New Jersey, they come up and they go through a whole book. There's a whole big procedure for it. And they really everything's cataloged. And you grab a kid or a couple, go, what'd you find? You point at it and like, okay, and then they kind of know what they're dealing with. So one of the senior chiefs actually ended up going in there and ended up pulling up, some of the remaining rounds that went down there. I think they all turned out to be inert, in that one. Before my time, they found some C4. That was before my time. A similar situation, I guess. Went missing somewhere, and they called a couple of kids or a couple of guys, and where is it? And that was in, somewhere out in like Garrettson Creek or something, I think, like that. But that was before my time.
And there's also the component of blackwater diving, where most of the time, and this, especially in the Hudson, you can't see. And that's where it gets terrifying for any special operations diver, either on both the PD side or the FD side, because they have their divers too. And I'm sure you trained a lot in that. So I'll ask you, because I have one of the guys that would know, having done it so many times over the years. When you're in an element where you're looking for evidence, or worse yet, you're looking for a person in distress, or even just trying to recover somebody and give the family closure, and you can't see the hand in front of your face, what was the training to that? And when you were actually in the real situation where, you've had the training already and now it's a real call out, what helped you?
So it depends on what we're looking for, right? Like if we're looking for a body, you can spread yourself out a lot bigger, and you kind of go through the bottom, and unfortunately, at some point you go face to face with some dead dude on the water. You kind of feel it out and you pull it in. If you're looking for other things like, guns or safes or ATM machines, you work a pattern a lot smaller. So there's you and another guy that are kind of swimming along, which is called a jackstay pattern. So it's a line on the water, 2 grappling hooks on the end of it, and you're just kind of going down, moving your hands back and forth. So you're going really slow, and anything that you touch, you got to kind of really pick it up and feel it and try to figure out in your brain, what is this, right? It could be a bottle, it could be a can, it could be a shopping cart, it could be a bicycle. So anything smaller, you can kind of feel it. Like if we're looking for a gun, this is small enough. It may be a gun, it may not be a gun. You could throw it in a catch bag that you got with you, kind of keep going on. When Randolph, I was out of the team by then, but when Randolph Holder was killed, and that gun battle was on the Harlem River, the team, the guys found the actual projectiles and shell casings underwater from that shootout. I mean, they were, that was extenuating circumstances for sure. Blackwater diving, heavy currents. And they went down and they actually found, the actual projectiles in the water, just picking up literally everything, piece by piece by piece to put that whole case together.
And it's amazing. I mean, you can dredge up just about anything down there. Cars down there, stolen cars that people wanted to ditch, weapons, anything that's down there. Sometimes bodies, And I recall my first exposure to scuba it was fictional, but a 1999 episode of Law and Order is a rerun. Briscoe and Curtis are trying to solve a case from the 70s in this particular episode. Here comes scuba. They dredge up the van in which a body was in that van. And subsequently, so began the homicide investigation. But it's all in the feel, like you said. And it's almost like being blind. You're completely blind down there. But that's where you're so glad to have that training. And you realize, even if the exercises when you're doing them may seem silly in the moment, you realize just how valuable they are.
Yeah, I mean, when you start out, they actually put you in a police academy pool. You start working the pattern line back and forth, and then they black out your mask. It's a completely controlled environment, and then you start, just working in the slip behind the harbor base, and they start moving you out. And the hardest part, truthfully, are the currents. There's the currents and the entanglements that you can end up in down there. So, the Hudson River can run 4 knots, at max flood or max, ebb. And then there's shopping carts, and I mean, just name it. It's just there's a century worth of stuff that's down there. So you deal with the current, you deal with the entanglements. That's really the most dangerous part is, that not, coming up with something that you find, but just making sure that you're in a position that you're able to kind of get yourself out of, without panicking, which is why we do the harassment exercise.
Mhm.
Not panic and just kind of be able to think your way out.
Depending on the nature of special operations work, sometimes the seasons play a big role in the weather outside. Some are friendlier than others. So tell me, what was the season that was friendliest for a scuba diver?
Um, I would say like the spring and the fall. I mean, it's pleasant outside. The water's just warming up. But the spring is what they'll call floater season, right? Anything that kind of goes into the water over the winter. If it's not, nobody knows it's there. As far as like a human, that'll usually come up sometime in April, as what are we at the end of May, end of March right now. Another couple of weeks
Mhm.
before season, when that water hits a certain column, a
Yeah.
certain temperature in the water column, everything will start to kind of pop up that time of year. So it's an unfortunate time of year, but the conditions outside are nice. The water's getting a little bit warmer. July, it's that water's really warm, and it's it could be 100 degrees outside. You're wearing a black vinyl suit, and that gets pretty hot. The winter time is terrible. I mean, it's 0 degrees out. If there's, the water temperature is 33 degrees, that water's looking to take your life, every time you get in there, when it's that cold.
Yeah, and I've heard those stories about that. I mean, I go back to an episode of Cops, 1994. This was the real thing, where ESU had a situation. The guy was pulled out just fine. It was an EDP. He was looking for oil, so he dives into the water. And mind you, it's during the wintertime. Kenny Winkler from One Truck, who's been on the show,
I
he
don't care.
goes in there. Yeah, great guy. And he loved diving, which I don't know why. He's a madman, but he loved it, and probably still does. He's going in there, calm as can be. Kenny. Yeah, all right, let's just go and get the guy. And mind you, it's wintertime and it's
Yeah.
night. So that's a double whammy right there, where not only is it dark as it is because, the time of day, but it's also cold. So if that water had an opportunity to kill you, it's right then and there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And
Yeah.
the rule of 50s, a 50-year-old man has a 50-50 chance of surviving 50 minutes in 50-degree water, where he's got a 50-50 chance of swimming 50 yards in 50-degree water. So you kind of start to figure out where you are, what the water temperature is, and how long somebody, can last on the surface if they're able to.
hmm I wanted to mention, of course, it is air, sea, rescue. So your relationship with aviation, you guys have to work hand in hand, and they're
Yeah.
essential to what you're doing. Sometimes you're diving in just off the port. Sometimes you got to be helicoptered down to certain portions of the water, not just the Hudson, but any body of water in New York City. And that's where, again, that cross training comes into play. Of course, they're part of SOD as well, and then the real deal comes in. So tell me about some of your favorite pilots to work with, and just the general cross training that went on with them, and how that benefited you throughout your career.
I mean, frankly, all of them. I mean, the aviation guys and gals, really some of my best friends in the world. We spent so much time with them, right? We worked 12-hour tours. We were embedded with them. We ate dinner with them. We ate breakfast with them. Hung out in the ready room with them. Yeah, I mean, they were all just super competent people, right? They put us in a place that, that pilot in charge, and that co-pilot, that's running all the radios and all the other stuff and watching obstructions. And then the crew chief that's in the back, that's in charge of the divers. And it's such a well-oiled machine. I mean, really, without one of those elements in there, it doesn't work. But just really all of them. I mean, there are so many to I mean, I'll give her a shout out because I'll see her soon. But Erin Nolan, phenomenal 412 pilot. There's just so many. Mike Cilia, there's just so many of them.
I was going to ask you about Mike Sileo. So that's literally my next question. Did you work with him? And of course, the answer to that question is yeah.
We got to keep it separated though between you said it earlier. Mike is awesome. He was a great pilot, Mike. He was a great friend.
And he had a heck of a rescue he made not too long
Yep.
ago. But right at the end of his career a few
Yep.
years ago, that I got to message that guy on LinkedIn. I keep forgetting to do so, but I would love to get him on the show. Let's see. Joe Maliga has a rather interesting question. He's a retired correctional officer, so he always throws little funny comments in the chat. If we could highlight that one, producer Vic, bring that one up real quick. Let's see. There we go. Detective Sichler mentioned doing training and becoming an NYPD frogman. Did he ever get training and become a stork?
No.
He did not. Thank you, Joe. He's always good for a laugh, and of course, in the chat, like I said, retired CO from up in Rochester. So these missions continue, and really after 9/11, when Ray Kelly came in and beefed up the counterterrorism program for the NYPD, to a healthy degree, he incorporated scuba because, as you said earlier, like, even though it wasn't a terrorist incident, those inert devices from the World War II veterans' house, some of them are going into the water. So sometimes, listen, these terrorists are smart, and we won't go into the nooks and crannies of every single detail because we don't want to give anybody the blueprint. But there's been instances all over the world where they've attacked underground or underwater.
Sure.
So in those instances, without getting into the classified stuff, especially when there's big events, for example, like a presidential visit or UNGA, especially UNGA, tell me about what would go on during that period of time.
Another big one too is Fleet Week, right? So you include
Yes.
Fleet Week and all that stuff. So that whole security package, it starts out a couple of days before. We would sweep the tugboats that are involved and go out and get the Navy vessels, right? So we'd be underwater looking for limpet mines and those things. And that was a whole counterterrorism training that we did for explosive devices way back when. And so you would do that, and then depending where the ships were going to be moored, right? All those different docks and piers on the west side, those would all get searched. UNGA, right, with the UN. I won't get into specifics of that one too, but Manhattan is an island, right, and there's different ways to do things there, right, for sure. So July 4th is another big one, right? There's all the fireworks, all the barges. So we would typically, and on a positive side too, because you really can't see too much, there's some technology that you can use, right, like side scan sonar or handheld sonar, depending on what you were doing, to kind of look for anomalies on certain structures. But the other thing that it did for us was get us, we learned what normal looks like, right? So you know what normal looks like. And if there's an anomaly, whether you're diving in or whether you're using technology for it, you can then figure out, like, there's something going on here. We don't know what it is. We need a further investigation.
I think what's interesting about scuba compared to other units in SOD is if you look at ESU still goes out on patrol. They have plenty of time to train, of course, but they're going out on patrol. And even though they're not part of SOD, what they do is technically SOD, so I'll throw the bomb squad in there too. The bomb squad and scuba are kind of similar in that they're on call. They don't patrol for the most part unless there's special circumstances going on. So it gives you more time to train, and that's not to say the job doesn't come with its stressors. There's certainly crazy days, but for the most part, you're not dealing with the grind of patrol where anything could happen at any given moment. For the most part, the settings are pretty controlled. So tell me about taking advantage, even if it wasn't department mandated training, just you personally trying to stay sharp, especially as you got more time in the unit.
I mean, everybody, physical fitness was a big thing for us, right? We had guys that were state champ swimmers, state champ cyclists, Division I All-American water polo players. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. So you had to be pretty fit, to kind of get in and out of the boat very quickly in a rough situation. So there was always time. You found time to work out, every day. And if you didn't for a little bit, guys would get on you for sure. You got to carry your own weight. That was something that we would do all the time. Or, another thing, if we were just doing some regular training, up at Hart Island in the Bronx, there was some really old, we'll call it artifacts, right? So you could just do like a nice, easy, fun dive just to kind of get some, try out a new piece of equipment or work on your buoyancy because something's different depending on the time of the year and the equipment that you're wearing. So you could find different, plates and bottles from different ships from, the turn of the century, the 1900s, which was pretty interesting, So, you found a way to do things like that, and make it a training environment, and also get some value out of it, for yourself.
I got to ask you, as I had him on the show last summer, I forgot to ask this earlier, shame on me. Did you work with Oscar Smith?
Yes.
Yes, that's another gem of a guy. And I remember he told me a story. To your point on training, he was diving one time, and Cameron Danner was the chief of SOD back then, And he, I guess one of the cops was looking at Oscar like, what is he doing? And Cameron Danner's like, no, don't interrupt him. He's training. He's doing exactly what he's supposed to do. To your point about taking advantage of opportunities to stay sharp. So, mind you, Oscar, I think he got to Scuba in like 97, if I'm not mistaken, or so. So you have guys like
You got
that
there
in
after
Scuba.
me. I got there in
Oh,
'02.
after
He
you.
got a little bit after. I think he got on the job before I did, but he got to the team, I don't know, maybe a year or two after I did.
I think so. Yeah, I think you're right. I think he got on the job itself in 97. You're right. So you got guys like that, you know, like to your point, right? Physical fitness. It helps when you run a gym outside of your job as a police officer, as he does. But still, nevertheless, it shows the importance, because if you don't, it sets a bad example for any newbies coming in. And that segues perfectly into what I wanted to ask you next. And that, if fast forward, it's 2009, 2010, you got close to a decade in the unit. So now you're in a position where you could train the newbies coming in as you were trained in 2002. Besides the obvious things about staying in shape and, of course, being respectful and staying on top of what your day-to-day assignments were, what were some of the things that you would tell them based off your experiences to guide them and help them in their transition to the unit?
Some of the best advice I got right early on from, and I'll give him a shout out. I don't know if he's listening, but Frankie Pellegrino, he was kind of like our squad leader, you know, and just a phenomenal diver recreationally, you know, as a PD frogman. And what makes sense is for us, you know, being underwater, there's never one giant catastrophe, right? It's a series of little ones, right? That kind of just start to add up amongst itself. And then it'll create, you know, that giant catastrophe. So kind of breaking that chain and recognizing when things start to go wrong, that you kind of got to interrupt and course correct and do something like that. So, you know, I got a couple of pickles for sure, you know, here and there. Everybody does, you know, just because you get wrapped up in something or tangled in something. You know, the first thing you got to do is, you know, slow down and calm down. So, you know, at the end of the day, you know, we run a, you know, the unit was, you know, run pretty hard and pretty tight, but you also got to make sure that you're bringing up guys the right way and say, hey, you got to be able to recognize, you know, that that cascading effect of things when they go wrong, right? Because it's just you and another guy down there. You know, we get dumped off, you know, by ARC Rescue. I've been, you know, offshore, you know, helicopters out of gas. They're going back with the victim that we rescued, and they drop you, you know, that life raft, you know, and you're out there bobbing, you know, and if that life raft, something happens to it, or, you know, they don't deploy the life raft, it's you and another guy, right? So you had to be very physically fit, you know, just and have that trust together, because there's nobody coming, right? There's nobody else coming
Right.
to get you.
A couple more questions on Scuba before I move on to your transition to gangs and guns in the Bronx. And that is, as far as rewarding rescues and uplifting moments, there's plenty of those. Are there tough days? Sure, but there's plenty of uplifting ones too. What's a really rewarding rescue or uplifting rescue you can recall from those dozen years?
Oh man, I mean, there were so many. You know, like you said, there's so many. I mean, we did a rescue that was offshore. It was 4 miles out in the middle of Ambrose Channel in the middle of the night one night. Unfortunately, there's a couple people that died. You know, and then one of my teammates went in afterwards and actually, you know, got somebody and trapped in a hole. You know, that was a big one. I think one that we remember that he was the only guy that ever came back and thanked us, but he was an off-duty FDNY fireman. Guy kind of got washed out. He was windsurfing. And then the wind just died down, and he was just, you know, stuck in the current. We found him offshore. And we picked him up. We deployed, you know, brought him back in the helicopter, and he was actually the only guy that ever came back and thanked us for rescuing him. You know, so that was. But he was a brother. You know, like he's somebody that recognizes, you know, that kind of thing. So I would say, you know, that was a special one for sure, because when we heard he was an off-duty fireman, right, that raises the stakes for sure. You know.
Oh, of course. And even though the FDNY and NYPD razz each other a lot and there's that sibling rivalry, keyword is siblings. At the end of the day, even though siblings fight, what happens at the end of the day? They love each other, and they love each other dearly.
100%. Yeah, 100%.
So, you know,
We'll
when
fight
it
with
hits
each
the
other.
fan.
You know, when I always said about, like, you know, we'll fight amongst each other, and you know, you'd see that kind of thing, especially as you get into the SOD services. But then at the end of the day, nobody gets to pick on my brother. You know, like they're the first ones to come to us. We're the first ones to go to them for sure. You know, like,
Right.
you know, there's nobody from the outside will ever be able to pick on, you know, a fireman. It's just not going to happen. You know.
Right. Exactly. And that's the way it should be. And the other thing is, and if you weren't there, it's fine. But I got to ask, I got a scuba guy here after all. Miracle on the Hudson 2009. Were you there for that?
I was. I got mobilized for it. So I was home when it went in. I actually got a phone call from an old delegate. He goes, "You watching TV?" And I said, "No." And it was the coldest day of the year. I remember it very specifically. He goes, "A plane just went in the Hudson." And I'm like, "You're got to be kidding me, right?" Turn it on. Sure enough, there it was. And then jumped in the car, ran down there, and then by the time they got the plane to, I think it was at North Cove, before they set up the dive ops, we were there. So I was actually the tender for the guys that actually went into the squad that was on duty. All right, it's obviously their job, so they get to, they're the guys that get the first crack at it. And because it was a potential penetration dive and stuff like that, we did put them on a tender for that. So I was one of the guys running the tender. Yeah, but it was, I mean, there was no victims left at that point. It was pretty much, let the NTSB know what we have, what's going on with the ship, with the aircraft, where's it going to go, what's it going to do, that kind of thing.
Right. I mean, that was an incredible job. And there was a guy that was so calm, and Sully Sullenberger, of course,
Sure,
you're referring to, that to this day, that has to be one of the most uplifting things I've ever seen. Because I remember I was 8 years old at the time, a month shy of turning 9. But you hear a jet goes down in the Hudson, you're thinking everyone's gone.
For sure.
I was listening to this on the radio, and I ended
For
up
sure.
hearing, oh, no, everyone made it out. Everybody's okay. I'm like, how?
I thought when I got the call, I was like, mid channel of the Hudson River is, 80, 90 feet deep. It's pitch black. That is that was going to be, even a bigger job than Flight 800. Which preceded me. I wasn't around for Flight 800. Luckily, right, everybody survived, on 1549. But I couldn't imagine. We've lost other aircraft, right, that are in the mid channel, the Hudson, smaller ones for sure, and those are complicated. But I couldn't even fathom. I mean, what that would take, to kind of set up that operation would be, tremendous.
The moral of the story is this: birds are stupid. Because that's the reason why that plane went down. Stupid birds see a big old jet engine. I'm going to fly into that. So we have learned in chat, listen, I shouldn't say that. But then again, some of these birds are just flat out retarded. And it showed that day, January 15th, 2009, because you almost took down a jet and killed at least 200 people. But thanks to Sully, the birds did not succeed. So
a couple of years ago, I bumped into a lady. She was wearing a T-shirt. Like it was like, I survived 1549, and I asked her about it. And I go, where'd you get the shirt? And she goes, oh, I was on it. So we started sharing our stories back and forth. And it was just completely random person, that I met over the summer somewhere. She was at a pool and was wearing the T-shirt. And it was pretty interesting to hear it from her side, because obviously I saw the movie, but talking to her, from her vantage point, it was pretty surreal.
So funny story that my friend Bill Cannon, who was a sergeant in Manhattan North Homicide, told me. So he gets dispatched there because he's thinking same thing you're thinking. It's going to be a mass casualty incident. And there was one guy they couldn't find. And he was the only passenger out of all the people on that flight that was missing. So you got divers in there looking for him, trying to see if he's under the water. And turns out this guy, after he got off the plane, just grabbed the taxi and went back to his apartment. So they go to his apartment and they're like, were you on the flight? He's like, yeah. It's like, do you realize everyone's looking for you? It's like, yeah, I just went home. And Cannon wanted to just about strangle the guy to get. It's like, you went home? Yeah, the whole city worried sick about you. You went home? But, he was all right, thankfully. So that was one of many stories. But thankfully, here we are all these years later, laughing about it because it had a good outcome, which you love to see. It was truly a miracle that day on that Hudson, as it's titled. So moving on in 2014, I mean, I listen, it was a great assignment, great couple of assignments you had in the Bronx, but I dare to say you had it made in scuba. Here you are. You're a senior guy in scuba at this point. You got a dozen years, 16 years in the job. It's a great place to be, but I appreciate the fact that you wanted to challenge yourself and go back to your roots in the Bronx. So tell me about that decision to leave such a great detail and go to another one, but nevertheless, leave a place that had really become your home.
It was for sure, and where I live upstate, and going out to Floyd Bennett Field or the Brooklyn Army Terminal, after 12 years, that commute really kind of destroyed me. It was awful. 75 miles, one way, $25 in tolls and gas. It was tough. So kind of ran its course, right, for sure. And then, I kind of got bit by the bug again and wanted to kind of, I went down to headquarters for a little bit for kind of like a physical and mental break. I worked in one of the deputy commissioner's office, for about a year. And then I was like, I need to kind of go back to where my roots were, in the last couple of years before I retired. I was able to get myself up into gun violence and then Bronx gang.
So being in gun violence, it's interesting because Bratton had just come back in 2014, and
Yeah.
he's kind of looking at the lay of the land. He talked about this in his latest book, The Profession, which is why I bring it up. He's looking at the lay of the land, and he's really bringing back a modern 21st century version of CompStat, which was simple when he started it with Jack Mabel back in transit in the early 90s, which is all right, pinpoint where these incidents are happening, and let's just attack it. Let's just put the right personnel there. Let's put senior personnel like yourself there and get these guns off the street. And the majority of these gun incidents are unfortunately happening in the Bronx. So tell me about the investigations that went on, again, without going too deep into detail if they're still active. But the investigations that went on, the collars that went on, and how it tied into the gang life and unfortunately the drug dealers down there too.
I mean, truthfully, I wish I found those two units earlier in my career. I mean, the people that were there and the dedication, that they had, and really the investigative prowess that they showed. I mean, I when I got there, I was, even though I was a detective for 12 or 15 years at that point. They were the ones with the investigative experience, right? So they, even with 17, 18 years on the job, fortunately, a handful of them take me under their wing and kind of show us the ropes how to do it. And it was 10% of the people that were committing 80% of the crime. So they knew who they were. I won't get into the details of how they did it, but really a team effort about collecting video, targeting certain people. If they couldn't target you, for example, they target your friends, and they would just roll people up, that way, and then try to make a case. And if they could take it federal, they would take it federal, right? And that's where people actually got real time. And that's what made the difference between it. But really, just a phenomenal group of detectives that were really doing, really God's work out there. Looking for people that were, just shooting up everything. They were drug runners, they were gun runners, whatever they were. And they were just, the worst of the worst. The rap sheets that, they were pages and pages and pages long. People with multiple gun arrests. And those are the predicate felons.
Of course, and again, especially in today's day and age of social media, thank God most criminals are as dumb as they are because a lot of these guys are posting about it. What's the first thing you see in an Instagram story? It's some guy usually got a hoodie over his head and he's posing with the gun like a fool, and then, all right, I always laugh because I'm like, somewhere the gun unit is looking at that and saying, thanks. We
Yeah,
pinged
and
your location. We know where you
there's a guy or a gal, that can work on the lyrics that are behind stuff, and that's not so much admissible in New York anymore.
Yeah.
I think that ship has sailed, but that, and as far as what the lyrics were, and what the signs mean, and then what the gun is, and all these people coming together in their little piece of expertise to put together a case, that they would bring, either down to the Bronx DA or preferably the feds, and they really made a difference.
Yeah, I mean, there's this no snitching culture, right? But I laugh at that because let's face it, everyone snitches. When you're facing 60 years in prison, you're gonna snitch. So that goes right out the window. Whatever loyalty you had goes right out the window. And again, most of these guys are telling on themselves in these rap songs. Now, not every single one of these criminals is a rapper, but some of them are. And there was a viral song by some loser named TK. And I only bring this up because, again, the hilarity of it, not because I'm a fan of his or his music, but he had a song called The Race back in 2018, which went viral. And it had, got a lot of views on YouTube. If he had it on an album, it would have been a platinum selling record and it would have been a hit. And the reason why it was a hit is because he was a fugitive at the time, wanted connection with multiple gun arrests and multiple homicides. And those same lyrics, to your point, they played in court. He's now doing 55 years in prison.
Yeah. Most of the, like, when I was down in headquarters, I was really working on credit card fraud, and the amount of credit card fraud that rolled over into gangs and gun violence. That's where the money was coming from, and they were, those were some, started out as somebody swiping a credit card somewhere, and then you follow that train, and it led to the Bobby Schmurda takedown, with the guys in Brooklyn, that ended up taking that down. But that started out as a credit card case.
Yeah, it really, and again, he had a song. I'm going to call it "Hot Boy" because the exact title you can't say on the airwaves, or at least most airwaves. And again, the song came out. I'll admit, when it came out in 2014, I was 14 at the time. I was bopping to it. I loved the beat. I loved everything about it. Then I listened to the lyrics as I got older, and I'm like, oh, Bobby, no, why are we tweeting "Free Bobby" right now? Have you heard
Right,
the song?
right.
You listen to the lyrics. A man like that shouldn't really be free. Unfortunately, he is now. And listen, hopefully he can clean up his life. Hopefully he's learned from this and he can be a better person and make the most of his second chance. But I'm like, yeesh. Like, no wonder he went to jail.
I remember one of the cases we were working, and it had, so this is, 2015, 16, and it had something to do with the 7-3 precinct out in Brooklyn. And there was a Bitcoin. I didn't even know what Bitcoin was at the time. There was a Bitcoin machine in the laundromat, out in the 7-3 precinct. And to me, it was like the oddest thing. And you kind of, because Bitcoin was only emerging, at least to my awareness, around there. And then kind of watching the people go in and exchange credit cards for Bitcoin. It was, pretty strategic.
I'll say, and they're smart in certain regards that way, but you guys are always 10 steps ahead of them. And really, where you have a drug runner or a gang member, you're going to have a firearm. It's almost kind of, alpha and omega for sure in that regard. It's always kind of intertwined at the hip, even if it's something minor, like a guy that's peddling weed. That's when I laugh when people get mad at what they perceive as the NYPD targeting people for quote unquote low level drug arrest. I'm like, it's never low level when it comes to narcotics. It's not like the hippies. I forget the name of the movie. It's Jim Brewer and Dave Chappelle. Half Baked, I think is the name of the movie in 1998, where those are harmless guys. That's not what's actually happening. Even if it's a low level weed like that, they almost always have a firearm. Why? Because they have rivals or people coming to rip them off. And 9 times out of 10, that gun ain't registered, or even if it is, it's not registered under their name.
Right.
So it's a constant tug of war. Was there a point in time where you felt, because it's an endless cycle, it's a vicious cycle, but you can make a dent, especially if you're putting people away for a long time, and especially if the cases go on to become federal. When people think federal cases, when it comes to crime, they're thinking racketeering, they're thinking the mob or white collar crime. No, it applies to gangs too. Sometimes you can throw RICO at gangs depending on what it is. Was there a point in time where you felt, okay, man, we are really making community X, Y, and Z safer because things have changed from when I first got here? We put these people away and the neighborhoods changed for the better.
For sure. Right. I know some of the people that, that would get taken down in some of these cases, and how they would terrorize a certain building or a certain neighborhood were significant. Right. And they were a celebrated win when they got taken down. And I'll say I retired in 2018, a year or two later, the world goes haywire, and really, in the entire crime reduction that we saw from 98 to 2018 really got given back by 2020 or 21 for sure, and that was kind of frustrating, that we, for all of the things that we did and the sacrifices that we made or the neighborhoods made, and, innocent people that died or bad people that died, all these people died, to make crime go down. And then, it was really went back to where my career started, in those just 2 years right around COVID.
Yeah, it's incredibly frustrating because here's the thing you got to keep in mind, not you, but speaking generally, is that it doesn't matter what the ethnicity of the person is. If if there is somebody that's actively menacing the community and causing problems, whoever the community is, they don't want them there. It has nothing to do, like, for example, I'm half Dominican, half Puerto Rican. If there's a fellow Dominican or Puerto Rican causing havoc in the community, doing shootings, doing robbings, doing any robberies, I should say, doing any other sort of active criminal activity in the vicinity of where I live, I'm not going to look at it and say, well, he's Dominican, I'll give him a pass, listen, a fellow Dominican to Dominican. No, I don't want that guy on the streets. I want him in jail, So, and that's one thing, and unfortunately, in today's social media age, people don't realize, whoever it is, ask the residents of the community. They don't want them there, and they want them gone for good.
For sure, and some of them don't even open their mouths because they're afraid of it. Right? I mean, that's been going on for generations. For generations that goes on.
Before I ask you about your retirement in 2018, this occurred the same year you retired, and it shocked the city. You probably know what I'm going to bring up, and it really shocked the nation. Junior Guzman's killing was so brutal because you talk about an innocent person. Here's a kid that didn't deserve it. Nobody deserves to die like that. An innocent kid was an NYPD explorer, never involved in any kind of crime. You want to talk about a model kid who was on his way to doing good things despite the environment he was growing up in? It was him. And he meets this awful end, courtesy of the Notarios, who just stabbed him for no reason because they thought he was somebody else. Were you retired by the time that killing happened, or were you still on?
No, I was in the gang at the time. So we were the Trinitarios, just before that, or certainly after that, right? I mean, they declared, especially gang, right? They declared open season on them for us, and that was a really big suppression. We were looking at, really putting a hurting on them for sure. Yeah, that was an interesting case. I'll be careful about what I say about it, right? For sure. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. But that was an interesting case for sure. I mean, you remember the Trinitarios were not far from where we were headquartered, in gang, on the Bronx River Parkway. They were running down the Bronx River Parkway, the Trinitarios, and hitting people in cars, and all gang related violence. But there was 3 or 4 incidents, and you could Google them. I did a presentation on it not too long ago, but there was a significant amount of things that went on in that gang, around that time that were pretty significant.
Of course, and it culminated with that murder.
Yeah.
And that was, again, it was just a heartbreaking thing, especially when you see the video footage of him trying to get away. He's trying to go over a bodega counter. He's doing everything he can.
Yeah.
And yeah, his imprint is still felt. It's been 6 years. Hard to believe. It's been 6 years since his murder, but
It almost
just one
seems
of those.
longer than that. I remember seeing too,
Yeah.
because I was a medic too. So looking at the wound patterns and stuff like that, like they were pretty significant.
Yeah, very significant, because for those of you that don't know, Trinitarios is a primarily Dominican gang, and their weapon of choice is not, I mean, they probably have firearms too, but their weapon of choice is not firearms. They carry machetes. That's
Yeah.
kind of their trademark, if you will. They're known to carry machetes, and that's what they used in Junior's homicide. So I don't know if it was a case like that or a culmination of things, but there's always that moment or a series of moments that make a guy or gal in police work or first responder work, period, say, okay, I think it's time to go. What was the moment or series of moments for you that made you say, okay, you know what? This has been a heck of a ride, but I think I've reached my conclusion.
Mike, that's a great question, I'm retired 5 years, and you think about it now, and you look back, and I was retiring, because I was getting ready to do some stuff in my home life and stuff. But you look back, and it's almost like the culture of the NYPD and probably other law enforcement is when you get on, you can't wait to retire. You start talking about retirement right away. But in my opinion, it's really kind of, and I had that mentality for a while, but then you had kids, and it was like, I can't wait. I get 5 more years to retire, but you wish that time away, but you wish your kids didn't grow up during that time, right? So, really trying to kind of find yourself in that time and be like, you got to enjoy the moment, for yourself. The time is going to, the job time is going to tick away. Nobody prepares you for retirement. To be honest, it's a conversation now with a lot of people nowadays. Nobody, prepares you for that. And you just kind of look at, I'm going to retire in 20 years. I'm going to retire in 20 years. And the time comes, and a lot of people get cold feet because you don't know what to do afterwards, frankly. That's a conversation I have with a lot of retired guys now, to be honest.
Mm-hmm. And there is life after the job, and that's the important thing to realize. So that's why, listen, I get it when guys are working 2 jobs at once, because that transition becomes a heck of a lot easier. Yeah. Some guys use their schooling. Some guys just have completely different hobbies that they go into full time, and it becomes jobs for them after they retire. So I don't know if you can go into it, and if you can't, it's fine. But what are some of the things in retirement now? It's been 5 years, as you said, that keep you busy, and what are you plugging away at these days?
The best advice I got when I retired, somebody had said to me that when men and women of uniform, police, military, fire, whatever it is, when they retire, they lose 2 things: their sense of identity and their sense of community. Now, I don't think the job was really ever my identity. Like, I'm not Danny Reagan or Andy Sipowicz, but it was certainly my community, right? So, I've connected with that. I stay connected with that community, whether I'm teaching, either in the medical environment or the tactical environment. I work for a company now that I'm an SME, right, in chemical warfare, decontamination, but I connect with police, fire, military, hazmat. So I'm still connected to the guys. I just get Christmas off now.
Yeah, it's nice. It's that time off, especially if you got a family too. It's imperative, because, like you said, I think of that Fleetwood Mac song, "Landslide." And what's the purpose of the song, or what's the theme of the song? Talking about the people in your life getting older and growing up, and you realize just how much of that, as a firefighter, as a police officer, as a first responder, period, that you miss. And it's like, crap, where does the time go? But that's where, listen, Retirement's so great because even if you still are working in retirement, it's a much different schedule. You can be present more. Dad is around more.
For
Mom
sure.
is around more. Or even grandma and grandpa's around more. And it becomes enjoyable. And even though you miss the job, you don't miss what you were missing out on, if that makes sense.
Correct. 100%. Right. I'm sure you've heard it a million times. You miss the clowns, but not the circus.
Right. Yep. Oh yeah. That's literally what pretty much 99.9 of the retirees I've spoken to on this podcast have told me. You miss the clowns, but not the circus. You miss the memories, but not the bureaucratic nonsense that goes
Correct.
along with it. And it's an experience that you're better off for having had. It's a great job. It's a great city to work in. And definitely, as the old Steppenwolf song says, it was a magic carpet ride.
Yeah, for sure.
So the hour's flown by, and we'll end as we always end with the rapid fire. It's 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. They're not terrifying. They're actually pretty easy. And the first one is, and you can say multiple here if you want, or you could say pass. Funniest call you ever responded to, either on patrol, scuba, whatever it was.
So I remember it was there was a guy. A lot of naked people end up in the water, and one of the teammates he deploys out of the helicopter. He grabs the guy was intoxicated. He had no clothes on, and they're pushing him up the ladder. And the naked guy fell off, and the scuba guy was bald and fell on top of his head. And the joke was you couldn't see where one ended and the other began. So that was a pretty funny one, and I'll leave it at that.
we can let our imagination fill in the rest of the gaps there. You already answered most uplifting call, so we'll gloss over that one. If not for the NYPD, what other career could you have seen yourself pursuing and enjoying?
I mean, I looked at right. I like medicine, right? So I guess the dream was always, to kind of be an orthopedic surgeon, but calculus kind of squashed that dream for me. So something like that, or I guess I always did really, though, truthfully, in some form of a uniform, whether it be police, military, or fire. I had bad knees. I'm at my 9th knee surgery now. So I was really always disqualified from like military special operations, which is really why I joined the NYPD.
Nah. Okay. From any point in your career, could be towards the end, the beginning, whenever, or your time in scuba, favorite bar or restaurant in New York City?
Oh, I was waiting for that one. So when I was in headquarters, we actually made a spreadsheet of the best places to eat in New York City. So I'm going to ask you, you have a specific borough in mind?
It could be any borough. I'm not prejudiced.
So I will say a couple of my favorites, right? In Queens, Saripa Prai for Thai food, right? It's world renowned. In the Bronx, I'm a big fan of Mike's Deli, right in Arthur Avenue. Those are probably two of my favorites. And then if I got people in from out of town and we go to Manhattan, I will go to the Carmine's Uptown. Well, it's not as touristy as Times Square, but everybody's usually captivated with the food there and the whole type of service there. So I would say those are a couple there.
I should do that. I got to make a spreadsheet of all the restaurants that guests tell me, and one by one across the years, that could be a side project. I got to start doing that. Producer Victor and I got to start doing that. That way, one by one, we can cross them off our list anytime that we go into the city. And the last question of the rapid fire is, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would the retired George Sichler of today in 2024 go back and tell young rookie George Sichler back in 1998?
It's a great question. Keep your mouth shut. Right. Keep your mouth shut. Know your place as a rookie for sure. And you think you know it all, but you don't.
Yeah.
Right?
Listen, that applies to any job.
Respect the guys with some time. And be a good listener and a good learner. Right. You don't know it all.
Yeah, you got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason.
Yep.
So listen, I hear you there. Shout out to everybody that tuned in tonight via YouTube, of course, LinkedIn and Twitter. I see Garrett Lindgren, FDNY Rescue 3 in the chat. Matt Shirley's here. Good to see you as always. Pete Segretti, retired emergency service cop.
Oh, Pete. Hey, Pete.
Yep. Another good guy who I really want to come on the show. Pete, come on already. Quit holding out on me.
I'll talk to Pete for you.
Yeah, I got his number. I talked to Pete quite a bit, and he's like, I don't know. Am I really that interesting? I'm like, yeah, you work in JTTF and you work in SU. Yes, you are. Listen, I appreciate the humility, buddy, but come on down. I really want to have you on. Before we go, stick around. We'll talk off the air, but any shout outs to anyone or anything you want to give, George?
No, just thanks for having me on, Mike, and really to the guys and gals in the department, keep doing what you did, and to the frogmen, best part of my career.
Well, there you go. Chris Ebden's in the chat as well. Chris, I want you to come on the show too. Old school NYC EMS guy. So message me when you can. Got to get you on too. Coming up next in the Mike the New Haven podcast, we may have a rare 3-show week next week. We'll have to see how it shakes out. It depends on the scheduling. I know one of the guys, Garrett, you worked with him, or at least you know of him, Rich Rotans, who was a former New York City Fire Department captain and one of the founding members of the New York City Office of Emergency Management back in 1996. That should be Best of the Bravest, volume 56 this Wednesday. And next Friday, Tales from the Boom Room, Profiles of the NYPD's Arson, Explosion, and Bomb Squad is back. We haven't done a volume of that since last July, but this guy will mark the return from hiatus for that miniseries. And that is going to be Billy Neese, who worked in the Bronx as well. And in 2004, after a long time working in different assignments in the Bronx, decided he wanted to really up the ante and go into the Bomb Squad. Why? I don't know, but he'll tell me about it next Friday for a brand new volume, first in almost 8 months, of Tales from the Boom Room, Profiles of the NYPD's Arson, Explosion, and Bomb Squad. In the meantime, on behalf of George Sichler and producer Victor and all of you in the audience tonight, and those of you that will listen to this later, I'm Mike Colón. We'll see you next time, and have a great weekend, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.